I'm just waiting for a thumbs up from the tech guys in the back. I have a thumbs up. Kia ora, everybody. Welcome to BeLink Innovation. Welcome to Lincoln University. Welcome to our innovation series today. Today will be both live streaming, recording, and we have audience here in the room. So if you see me looking out into the distance, I'm actually trying to look into the camera for the people online. Welcome for you guys as well. The first couple of slides are actually a little bit about housekeeping, and then I will introduce the speakers. Before I do so, we were actually fascinated by the green economy and the growth thereof, also globally, but also the challenges that the economy has, both from new products and more sustainable products, financing, supply chains, you name it, it is all out there. So that was actually the reason why we have a really brilliant lineup of speakers, giving us different perspectives on the topic. So today we're going to do it a little bit different than we would normally do in innovation series. So for the familiar faces, yeah, we're going to mix it up a little bit. For the new faces, well, this for you be as a business as usual type of thing. We'll have 3 speakers, and I will introduce every speaker individually before they come to the stage. They will actually give you a presentation with their perspective on the green economy. Afterwards, it's up to you guys, and so we'll have a panel discussion. So you can basically start to ask all the questions that you're thinking of, like, oh, can you explain that a little bit more? Oh, I've heard this. Can you put that in the perspective of your talk? What we'll do then we're going to flip. So, and for the people online, there will probably some question opportunities for you guys to email us. And then the speakers will actually ask you a question or pose a discussion topic with you. What we'll do then is we will provide you a really nice lunch. So under that lunch, you can actually talk about the question or the topic that the speakers basically post to you guys. Now, the lunch is really nice. So yeah, I see a couple of scared faces. No, it will be really, really, really nice. And then for the ones that haven't escaped through the back door, we would love to hear what your discussions were all about during lunch. Because here at BeLink, we really believe that if we can get people to talk, that's where the real magic happens. So that's what we like to do with you guys today. But before I'm actually going to introduce John, our first speaker, I will just run through a little bit of housekeeping. I pressed it big, yeah. Emergency exits. We do not expect any fire drills. So if we hear the alarm, it is the real deal. We have an emergency exit to my left here. The door that you guys came in to is an exit. We have doors at the back of the room, and we even have doors here. If there is any issue, I see a lot of Lincoln University or some Lincoln University staff here as well. We go to the grassy area in front of or in the back of Lincoln agri-tech, but we will make sure that you get out of the building safe. Toilets. The door that you came into, you walk through a little hallway to us. So if you walk back that way, it is the 3rd door on your right-hand side. And there are refreshments. So in other words, even if you say for the change of speakers, and if you just want to grab another cup of coffee or grab yourself another muffin, feel free to do so. Okay, for the people online, you guys are muted, but you can use the chat function and to actually talk to us, especially if you wanna ask questions. And then Katie in the back of the room, she is monitoring that. So that's when the questions will actually be posed to the panelists. Yeah, and the cool thing is that we will record this as well. So if you guys want to share this with your colleagues in a couple of days, you can actually do that. Like I already said, B-Link Innovation, we are the innovation hub here at Lincoln University. We are a full business unit of the university, and we really believe in connecting people and where collaboration actually starts. And that's hopefully what we'll do today. First speaker is John Saunders, Dr. John Saunders. And he works here at the university at the Agribusiness and Economics Research Unit, and he has been doing a lot of modeling on economics and looking making sense of these things. And some were like sticking out, yeah, that's easy, and the other one's like, how are we going to explain this? So, yeah, John, can you enlighten us on your vision of the growth of the green economy? You want to lecture, or do you want to have?
I'll try the mic if that's.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Hello, hello. Was this mic check 1, 2, 3? I'll stop from giving my battle rap or anything, much to everyone's delight. Hi, I'm John Saunders from the ARU here on Lincoln campus. So thank you very much to B-Link and Wim for having me along. Just so you know, and that you can feel much relieved early on, I mostly do economic modeling. However, I'm not going to talk much about that this time, so you don't have to worry about one of the driest subjects known to man. So here we go. Green economy, wonderful, great. And so, thank you to Lincoln, of course, ARU. So the green economy has a lot of potential, a really high growing market, big potential players coming on there. Of course, there's regulatory hurdles to achieving these, but, I think it's something we can overcome, and the gains are really just worth, oh, shit, sorry, wrong green economy, right? But well, it's not bad. Those numbers are pretty good. I thought, that could, don't leave it out, This is just the levels I go to try and be a cool economist, isn't it? It's not worth it. It's not worth it at all. Anyway, so New Zealand green economy, sort of why do we want it? What is it and how can we leverage it? And especially for agriculture, which is sort of my little part of the world that I talk about and do all this really dry modeling. So a lot of my usual work talks more about climate change and adaptation and savings. So this, I'm just going to talk a bit more broadly about some of the work we have done that keys into getting premiums, the role of science and the role of policy. So I think, how well set up as a country are we to leverage some of these things, and do we have to? We're all pretty lazy, I think, and I'm a really bad morning speaker. It's, not enough time for the coffee to kick in. I really, afternoons when I'm good. So this question of do we have to, I think is very, very valid. So let's start with New Zealand, somewhat unique. New Zealand had some of its own challenges and some of its own benefits. So why is one reason New Zealand's unique? Well, here's OECD countries, the percentage of their total emissions that come from agriculture. Okay, I've left out New Zealand. There's Ireland in green, above 30%, about 35% for comparison of another, country with a lot of agriculture. Where do you guess New Zealand will be on this? And look, I know you're all really intelligent people who probably know all the answer to this, but humor me for a moment as we go through some of the background. Oh, look, we've got an answer. 50%. Damn, he's good, isn't he? See, I knew I'd be preaching to the choir, but there we go. Compared to all the other nations, and if you look at the OECD average, we're way above it for a developed nation. So that's one thing we kind of already have as an elephant in the room for New Zealand, and especially when dealing with some of these big international agreements. And there's a lot of arguments why this is. We already had a lot of renewables. A lot of the energy sector had less low-hanging fruit, but still that's the state of play for New Zealand. So developed economy with really high emissions from agriculture. All right, so what do we actually do in agriculture as a country? So here's emissions intensity by head. So let's just see here. Okay, which one's the one that we do? Surely, oh no. We do a lot of the big one, isn't it? We do a lot of the, okay, and what's the other thing we do? Oh, the non-dairy version. Oh, bollocks. We've really picked sort of the wrong horse for the whole greenhouse gas. Well, what about other intensities? Okay. All right, so by water use and, okay, yes, dairy is also the worst there. But what? with really high hits. It's horrible. What's the least efficient animal I've ever seen in my life? You know, why? Why are we bothering with a silly animal that takes so much resources and puts out so many emissions? Oh, shit. Yeah, all right, well, let's stick with dairy then. That sounds good to me. As an economist, that looks really clever. And, you know, we look at New Zealand's, you know, whole economy, food and fiber, and dairy is a massive part. They're 82% of our exports, 10% of our GDP, and 30% of employment. All right, so we're kind of in this really weird situation, right? We're a developed nation with tons of emissions from agriculture, but it's kind of really helping we're having a nice standard of living and a great life on the basis of this. And, you know, through COVID, some of our agricultural exports was one of the things that helped us keep our terms of trade, keep money coming in, and, you know, keep us all fed and happy. So we're kind of at this awkward place, right? Yeah? No? New Zealand unique? Oh. I hadn't thought of that. That's a really good point. By kg of milk solids, we're actually one of the best in the world. Great minds, mate. Great minds. So it's not all doom and gloom, and you're right. We're really good at this. But the problem is, of course, it's not a fair world. We can't say if anyone should be producing dairy, it should be us. Or if we do, we need to convince our consumers of that. But the trouble is we're in international agreements which are on the basis of our whole economy, not what's happening in the rest of the world. So it's kind of an unfair game, but that's the sort of reality we live in. So what can we do about it? How can we keep our economy good, but maybe reduce our emissions? Is there any win-wins, you know? And so if only there was a group of researchers at some really cool land-based university, you know, who'd been looking into this sort of stuff for a while. But, you know, what are the chances of, oh, shit, hi. Okay, so the AERU, do you think I've ticked off enough branding on the slide? You think that's sufficient? Yeah, okay, you might remember it after all that. So we've been looking into this idea of win-wins and how we could have a sustainable or viable, sort of environmentally viable production system, still keep agriculture in New Zealand, but how do we get paid for it? How do we get paid for doing these good environmental actions? So a long time ago, we had this pilot study we did, because we want to say, we think consumers overseas, some of these markets we're selling into or could sell into, do value things outside of low price and, you know, low price and good taste. So this thing, consumers are willing to pay for credence attributes. And credence attributes aren't just, you know, the credits on a CCR album. They're the sort of things outside of the things you can perceive when enjoying, experiencing a product, the story behind it, the environmental, you know, credits of it. And so this was the initial slide we had, and you can see there's greenhouse gases in there. But the main message was, at the time, no one thought these markets would actually pay more for, you know, good social welfare, good environmental care. So this was this long journey we went on, trying to say, hey, look, you know, these wins are out there for us. It's a different question of how achievable they are, but at least let's understand the markets we're selling into. Some people in those markets are actually quite sophisticated consumers and do care about these things. So we had two big MB projects looking into this, and some other land and water ones after this. And so, yes, how much are they willing to pay for these different things? Understand our consumers, and how do we connect them? How do we maintain a supply chain that can bring that value back for producers? So if you're interested in that work, we've got a really cool website, aru.co.nz. Please go on there. It has all the results from this is over a decade's worth of projects and in-market surveys. So there's just an absolute ton of data on there, all available for everyone, you know, paid for by the New Zealand Science System. And so we went and did in-market studies on particular commodities and particular markets, you know, based talking to stakeholder groups and industry. And so it's the sort of work you'd hope that industry's already doing. The big guys should be already in market doing this, their own consumer research. But what about for your small, medium, or emerging sort of exporters in New Zealand? That this should be, look, we've went and asked that you can start getting your sort of head in the space of who your end consumer is and what the sort of things they value are and how you might be able to target those or find which of your values align with theirs. So there's a bunch more of there. Some of these were repeated multi-year, so we could see how it changes over time. It's quite interesting. Just to give you an example of why this might be useful or some of the things that we're finding from this. So that first message, just knowing your consumer. And so this is wine, Sauvignon Blanc in California. And this is a good way to just blame baby boomers for everything once again. So you can see here in the colors, we've got pretty much different generations of consumers. And so a usual story about how people like wines, oh, I like a French wine. Oh no, I won't touch it if it's not from Spain. You know, this idea of appellation up the top there, you can see really strong for baby boomers. That's one of the main things they're willing to pay for or base their consumption choices around. However, we come down to all our credence attributes, you know, water management, biodiversity, pest and disease, social responsibility, greenhouse gases. And it's these bloody millennials. They're killing the Appalachian market. You know, they're eating their avocado toast and they're buying based on whether it's organic or not. So suddenly you've got a huge generational shift in what consumers want from their wine. So if you're a marketer, where you should be putting the smart dollar or what you should be communicating to your customers. And interestingly, with the wine sector, we do a lot of these stuff. We have a label, a SWINS label on our wine, but we don't tell the consumers what it is, what it means, and why they should care. So there's a gap there in the thinking. We're already doing a lot of these things in New Zealand. We already have a great productive sector, but it's about communicating and seeing what actually resonates with your final end consumer. And this thing, don't assume. We came across this a lot of people go, well, I wouldn't want that, so I assume our end customer doesn't want that. You ran into that a surprising amount of time that, oh no, I've been in the industry for a long time. I know what consumers like. And it's, look, you do. There's lots of experience out there. However, a generational shift could make that a bit redundant. So ask, if we can ask, there's research out there, find out what your consumers are interested in. So just one more example of sort of some of the cool things from this. So this is looking for carbon neutral products and seeing if people are willing to pay more for a carbon neutral product. So you can see quite strong Japanese kiwi fruit, so a really high value market. You think quite sophisticated consumers, but you can also see the sort of trends over time. So staying quite stable. Interestingly, China drops off a lot. And for milk, gulp, that's something we should be worried about. But we should know about it, if you know what I mean. We should be finding out what the potentials are and why that's sort of happening. And also from this analysis, you can sort of find out how many of the consumers you're talking to. Is it all of them who care about this stuff? You can break it down to, look, maybe it's a segment of that, but you can understand that segment is maybe a higher educated segment. You know, who are they? Are they younger, older? You can sort of get the demographics around it so you know who you're talking to. I should say as well, this is all brilliant research and looks really impressive. Not me. This is the rest of the AIU doing great work. So a lot of this, you know, I helped out a bit on this work, but this is really Peter Tate does this great in-market surveys. But you can see this sort of idea, if you're talking about the green economy, if you're talking about new people coming into the market, what can you tell them? Well, if you're interested in getting some premiums, well, you better know who you're aiming these premiums at. Don't just go on what you think's good. Try and see what your end consumer thinks is good and then line it up with what you're already doing. And so that was, you know, we said, look, we think there's premiums out there. How do we achieve them? So again, I did all this work. This is the value chain compass. I definitely did all this myself. There's no single person in the audience who did most of this work that I'm going to pretend is mine. Thanks, Steph. So the idea is for a new producer, how do we go from a supply chain to a value chain? How do we make sure we maintain control of our product to the end market so we know our message is getting to the consumer, we're able to present it in the way we want and get that money back? And there were some really amazing sort of things that came out of this. You want leadership, you want to find consumers whose values align with yours so you can, you know. So anyway, this is also on the website. So there's an amazing bit of information. So, and especially if you're a new player, just getting you thinking about the ways you should be connecting with your market and maintaining relationships along your whole supply chain is really integral. So there you go. That's sort of the work we've done previously that says, this is how I might suggest someone goes about accessing the green economy in terms of getting premiums. There's a lot of work there. Please go to the website if you're interested, or talk to us or Tiff for the value chain stuff. But as a country, do we have to? It's a lot of work. It's expensive. There's, you know, it's difficult to do for the agricultural sector. Why bother? Can't we all just go home and have a hot cup of cocoa and, you know, binge watch some Netflix perhaps? Well, these happy people who eventually got a lot more depressed as it came along to COP28, maybe the optimism draining out of the global community around climate change. So as a country, we've already committed to reducing our emissions, and we've updated that commitment. And, you know, we're tracking pretty well, but it's still something as an international community, we've made promises to reduce our emissions. As I've said before, agriculture is kind of an elephant in the room for us that we probably have to deal with in one way or another. So we've talked about these premiums, potential wins, and okay, for a new emerging business or some niche things, sure. But what about our big players? Should they really have to bother? You know, we have strong commodity markets, really well-established supply chains. Well, just because we're unwilling doesn't mean our consumers aren't. And what happens if the consumers want it? Well, it'll be passed to us through our retailers and through the suppliers. So you've got things like Tesco's coming out and wanting to have sort of net zero across their supply chain. You've got Nestle making big claims about 2050 and sort of carbon zero. And some of the terms change, but still that impetus from consumers makes it through our producers. So even if we're not thinking about our end consumer, those signals are still going to be passed down to us. So it's something that, oh, all right, we should probably be thinking about and at least trying to move towards. So what can we do about it? How could we encourage industry? How could we help industry if we are thinking about we're going to have to make some transitions, or at least we're going to have to think about this? Okay, quiz. What do economists like? Do we like nothing? We're joyless husks of people who have been driven to madness by supply and demand graphs? Well, yes, that's true. But do we prefer, you know, incentivizing people to change? Do we prefer authoritarian, you know, dictating from the top and just making people do things? I kind of say that one because I helped out someone with their class and they were doing environmental policy. And he gave them all, okay, pretend you're talking to the minister and you have to come up with a solution to reduce greenhouse gases by 50% in New Zealand in 2 years. He thought the aim of this was to show them, okay, sometimes some things aren't achievable, so you have to give some different advice or some wise counsel. The group I helped immediately went to making death squads for cattle, and we're going to round them up and down the country. And by the time ran out, they were really trying to pick the color of sort of X-ray or night vision goggles these sort of cattle death squads would have to reduce our emissions. So just saying, watch out for Lincoln students if you're planning any drastic environmental policies. They don't mess around. But the obvious answer, you know, economists like the market to do things. The market has strengths, and so we like incentivizing the right actions. We like encouraging people. And so there's importance of using policy to, you know, encourage the right change, but there's still a danger of not regulating in a way. So what have we done with greenhouse gas policy as a nation? Well, of course, Kyoto Protocol, we started the ETS, we had grand ideas about what we were going to do with it. Kind of had this thing, all sectors except agriculture, put forestry in, and then, oh, we'll put agriculture in later. And then maybe a little later than that. And then maybe just agriculture checks if they have any emissions. They know they've got emissions, and then we just ignore the whole thing. Okay, great. Okay, well maybe we really do need to do something about it. So, you know, the partnership with industry, the primary sector, okay, recommendations to government 2020. Okay, we're getting somewhere now, right? Yep, cool, okay, we're going to do measurements 2024, end of 25, and national government who says maybe we'll think about it before 2030. Maybe, if we feel like it. So not looking hopeful. And so it's really the sort of foot in, foot out, foot in, foot out sort of approach to policy that's sort of, you know, the policy equivalent of maybe Morris dancing. And no one likes Morris dancing. It's not ideal policy. So why are we so shy about putting agriculture into the ETS or putting the agriculture into a pricing system? And for one, we're a competitive country that doesn't subsidize our agriculture. We don't want to price ourselves out of markets because, as we said before, the economy is important and agriculture is a huge part of our economy. So it makes sense. It's also quite a hard basket, and it's also something not a lot of other countries are doing. They have other lower hanging fruit before they get to agriculture. So you can have sympathy for why we might not want to do it. And you look at sort of national policy over the years when they've sort of said, let's not price. And a lot of it's kind of been, we'll let technological advancement come along. We'll let technology fill the gaps. And of course, technology will get us a lot of the way. You know, there's great breeding programs. There's a lot of brilliant work by brilliant scientists and agriculturalists who are helping our emissions and lowering emissions sort of as we speak in this low emissions intensity. There's great work being done there. However, If you don't have a pricing mechanism for carbon, if there's no incentive in a policy framework for you to lower your carbon, why would you invest in this technology? If you were a farmer, why would you implement the technology? So suddenly you've got a bit of a gap if you're saying technology will get us there, but there's no incentive, and being an economist, we like incentive. So even if you'd think the agricultural industry would, be better off, we'd rather not have pricing, of course. However, but that on the other side means there's no incentive for change, that if it's forced on us by a retailer, it's all come too late. We've had no chance to start implementing these technologies over along. We don't have a time to adapt slowly. So there's a danger of falling off a cliff if it starts coming from outside. If it's not our own regulation, it might be some of our retailers or consumers demanding this of us, and we haven't taken the time to get up to speed. So it could be a really harsh transition. It could be a really painful time for our producers, which is the last thing we want, right? So there's kind of this danger of over-regulating, of course, but there's a danger of under-regulating in the space, or at least not putting in incentives to start changing, if you believe this happens. So another thing here about efficient policy and sort of being strategic about any transition, should you think it's about to happen, I did some work on some of the evidence for the Climate Change Commission on Hewaka Ikanoa. So some of my boring modeling stuff about what might happen with different versions of a pricing policy. And interestingly, you think dairy, this really high emitter, well, it's so profitable, they can sort of wear some of the pricing, if it's, slowly eased in, and sort of adapt over time. It seems like there's at least a cushioning that they can adapt. So who really suffers? Well, of course, it's our sheep and beef farmers who already have reasonably low margins. And so it would just put a really large burden on them, and you'd sort of really start to see sort of transition out of the industry. Or at least that seemed to come. It would just be really hard yards for your sheep and beef industry. So, and that's not what you want. There's a lot of brilliant farmers out there. You want to support them in transition. But it sort of came this thing that was just a lot of people going, yeah, no, we'll get rid of them. And then we'll have all this sort of hard to manage land that's quite steep and out there. Well, what are we going to do? Oh, we'll just put it all in forests. That's all of that. And it's like, that is a huge transition for the entirety of New Zealand. And you just say, put it all in, no idea if we have the supply chains to manage this. That's at least if it's productive forestry, 28 to 30 years wait before you see returns on that. It's also quite a lot harder to go the other way and take land out of forestry and put it back into pasture. That suddenly it was this unstrategic just, we'll bosh all that into forestry without going, whoa. Is that what we want for our country? Is that the inevitability of that we don't want to face later? So the market's very good, but it can be short term, that we want policy to come in and make sure we're being strategic about the future of New Zealand. So there's sort of, history of New Zealand forestry, of course, a lot of deforestation. It's like, is that the plan? Is that the plan that we just return to having the whole thing forest? I don't know. All right. So is science going to save us? Is that the thing? Was I wrong about it? All right. Okay, here's the OECD gross domestic spending on R&D. So this is a percentage of your GDP, how much you spend on science and innovation. We're in dealing. It's all innovation. Let's help science. So here's the OECD average, about 2% of GDP. Where do you think New Zealand is? Saw it down. We're all optimists here, aren't we? Realists, I'm sure. So, no, that's the Czech Republic. Let's go down further. All right, there's New Zealand at about, less than 1.5% of GDP. If you look at the countries we're around there, it's sort of Eastern Europe, sort of Turkey. I like Eastern Europe. I'm not sure it's who I want to be compared to when I'm talking about R&D spending. So already, New Zealand has a history of underfunding its science compared to a lot of other developed nations. So already, we're not a strong country. We like to think of ourselves as really ingenious and innovative, but we don't put the money where our mouth is. And I'm sure women can tell us, putting on lunches costs money, getting speakers, it all can cost. That research, innovation, does have a cost at the end of the day. We're all brilliant, clever people, but at the same time, you need money to let these things happen. You need money to encourage innovation. Also, of course, with the new government in, we're in a bit of a black hole for science funding. So here's an RNZ sort of headline of going, there's a bit of a gap in what the actual national priorities for science are, if there's going to be funding, what that funding is going to look like. So there's a real period of uncertainty for New Zealand science as a whole, not just in the agricultural space. And uncertainty isn't good for getting long-term projects, getting projects together, not losing scientists, if we're worried about brain drain. So, all right, okay, well, bloody hell, it's not looking great for New Zealand science, but, at least we've got capability in the public sector that can help us out, right? Ah, nuts. Bollocks. So, of course, this idea of, cutting the fat out of the public sector, and, that's different. People can have different ideas of the role of government and the extent of the public sector. So, sure. However, MPI, if we're thinking about, we want an innovative, forward-looking, agricultural industry, I don't think making cuts to the Ministry of Primary Industry is going to necessarily help that. That seems a bit, hamstringing you while you're trying to just take off from the line. And, ag investment services. Well, that's kind of, you think it's exactly the sort of thing you'd want more capability in. And not the forest services. We're only going to be forest. That's the only thing we're going to be doing soon. So don't get rid of them. We'll need them. That's all, no one will know how these damn forests work after we planted everything up in them. So you can just see there's sort of a counter purposes sort of thing going on here, that really investment in agriculture is really, really beneficial. It will help us mitigate some of the bad things about climate change, but it'll also help us get towards some of the good things and be able to lower our emissions in a way, communicate that to customers, and be able to hopefully get some win-wins to cover the costs of any transition, if we have to make a transition. This is just a little bit on that. So here's the really dry literature. How much do you get back if you spend $1 on agricultural R&D over time? So here's the history of thinking on this, essentially. So this number over here, that's your rate of return. So that's in addition to your dollar. So sorry, and this is an index. So that's 62% more from every dollar spending you get back, down to, over almost 60% back, almost 50% back. But you get money back for everything you spend on agriculture. And also, it pays for almost generations. And you've got people saying it's almost infinite. You have these developments in agriculture that just keep paying dividends, but it's in the future. And that's the problem with the sort of short-term thinking. You have to put the money up now to get change later in agriculture. Money spent now will be paying off in 20, 25 years. So if we're not funding our agricultural science well now, well, you can expect that gap to hit in 20, 25 years. So again, something we're not very good at thinking about, strategy, long-term thinking. So I've got some other stuff here. I think you're all getting a bit bored of me. I'm pretty good at rambling. So I'll just skip through a lot of this. This is some of my boring modeling that I did that pretty much said, hey, look, over the long term, we don't have to worry about population. We're not going to all starve to death because we have high population, was essentially the punchline. I know that's a big punchline to gloss over, but you can always talk to me later about it. And there was a sort of idea that, okay, we're going to be okay. Total factor productivity is super important for maintaining low prices for the globe, for everyone. We're going to be okay, except, oh shit, you put in climate change, and suddenly that completely changes this picture around. And again, don't worry too much. I'm just quickly glossing over to get to this slide here. So agricultural greenhouse gas emissions for the globe, for everywhere. So doing this big model that looks at the big long-term changes, so the big drivers of change in agriculture. So population, investment, income. So pretty much as we can see here, that's sort of our baseline. That's how many emissions we have in agriculture for the globe. If we had so the highest population the UN thinks we might have by the end of the century, that's how much emissions we have in agriculture. Less than if everyone had great economic growth and we had really high incomes. So that's a really high income scenario. Suddenly we have higher emissions. These two are essentially lower growth in productivity, so lower investment in R&D, having less growth in productivity, and no growth in R&D. So the point of that, and the reason I'm showing you that, is to say most of the time talking about global agriculture, we talk about population growth as being the big key thing. When really, if we slow down our spending into R&D, that will have a bigger impact on how many greenhouse gases we have, how much the agricultural sector for the world is contributing to emissions. So it's this thing that science spending for agriculture is important on many, many different levels for the world and for New Zealand. And so it's part of this picture that What's the green economy for New Zealand? Well, that's just going to be a massive point of it. So anyway, I'll get out of your hair in a second. So, of course, as a country, agriculture is a bit of an elephant in the room when we talk about emissions. Great, but it's super important. It's great. So what's the incentive for producers to start looking for this? Okay, well, we can see there's win-wins out there if we can connect with our consumers, but it's very difficult. So ideally, you'd want a government that's in some way is encouraging or helping making those connections and maybe looking for that future. But this thing, it doesn't seem like, the hope of the green growth, it's a potential way we could have transition for agriculture in New Zealand at lower costs, or we could make it work because we're trying to help our consumers pay for that transition. However, it doesn't seem like as a country, we're particularly well equipped with our science system or our policy to encourage a transition. And so it's up to you to think whether there's a transition needed, when that'll come, what that'll look like. But if there is, I feel like as a country, this is oh wow, what a great opportunity potentially for how we're placed, how we have our image out there, all the great work, all the brilliant work our producers do. But if that's not getting to consumers and it's not getting supported by government in this development, we're kind of, we're having our hands tied behind our back before we sort of start. So that's just my warning around the green economy. Great opportunity for New Zealand. Are we ready for it as a country? What could we do better there? Anyway, oh, you can't even read that. That was a cheeky thing saying we should pay our economists more. Just, come on. The real ones we've got to think of with these transitions, what are our poor economists up to? Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me ramble, and yeah, cheers for your attention.
John, thank you so much. Hold your questions, because there will be time. I will introduce our next speaker, Hamish. And Hamish and myself go back a little while. So that's actually, well, with all the speakers, I have that personal connection. So this is actually a really cool event, but it's personal. Hamish started about 30 years ago looking at building consumer brands and branding, and basically articulating that value to customers. And it was a couple of years later in his career when he said, well, let's look at sustainability. Let's focus on sustainability, because this using full stop rather than looking at things holistically is not sustainable. Then in 2017, he joined the dairy industry, and he was part of the executive team of Synlait here in New Zealand. And recently he joined his own consultancy, if I'm saying that correctly, Hamish, and called the Pollination Group. And Hamish will actually talk us through the planet, I think.
What an introduction, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you for having me. Great to be back here in Te Wai Pounamu. Slides working, great. I'm going to be sharing three things. The first is I want to talk a little bit about the massive focus heading towards the food industry, which comes from our impact upon climate and nature. The second thing I want to talk about is how we will go about feeding 10 billion people by mid-century, or how the industry is thinking about how we will do that. Now, these are perspectives from the global food system, not necessarily perspectives from the New Zealand food system. In the third section, I really want to move to that, and I want to talk about what those perspectives, those first two perspectives, mean for the New Zealand food system, for New Zealand food producers, excuse me, and what we might be thinking about in order to protect ourselves, insulate ourselves from those global forces that are coming our way. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit, or just quickly introduce who we are at Pollination. We're an investment and advisory firm, actually. Wim, you were close. Advisory, same word as consultancy, effectively. We work exclusively on accelerating our clients towards net zero nature positive. Net zero when it comes to climate and nature positive when it comes to nature. We're around 200 people in offices in London and Washington DC and Chicago and Singapore and Sydney and in Melbourne. We work with governments and industry groups on policy. We work with investors on transition, and we work with corporates on strategy. I lead our global food and fibre advisory business, and in that area we work with the large sophisticated multinational companies in the food industry, and there's actually only 20 of them that effectively control 68% of global farmland. So it's the experience that I have had with working with those companies for the past 30 years that is playing out in these slides. We also work with high impact corporates that are just beginning on their sustainability journey. And we also have a lot of fun working with the system disruptors, the innovative companies that have the potential to really reshape the food industry in the direction where we need it to go to. So all of the work that we do for these companies is all around transition to net zero nature positive. So why do they need to do that? 3 reasons, and I'm pretty much going to reiterate here what it is John was talking about. And that is that there are kind of 3 forces that are making these companies move towards thinking more deeply about climate and nature. And the first is the rise of the conscious consumer. Really pleased to see that chart, John, because it is numbers behind our kind of more qualitative assertion that there's this rise of this sector, and it is really concentrated amongst millennials and Gen Xers, as you saw in that chart, but it also covers all elements of the demography globally. Actually, it's kind of a values attributed view, and these people are more and more interested in nutrition than they ever have been before. They're really interested in where their food is being sourced from. They're really interested in how workers are being treated, how animals are being treated, how their food is processed and distributed, all of these things. So they are having, kind of still in a niche way, they're having an impact on pulling through demand from the food manufacturers, the brands, and their suppliers further up the supply chain. The second reason those big global shaping companies are acting beyond the conscious consumer is because there's a wave of regulatory requirements coming upon them. We're seeing that in all economies as governments lean into their responsibility when it comes to climate and nature. That is being passed on to the brand owners. And the third one, which I think is probably the most important, is that there's a really embedded commercial need to address transition, because a lot of these companies that we're working with are seeing quite seismic shocks in their supply chain every year from climate events. We're recently talking to the world's biggest potato growing company, a Canadian-based company. I'm sure you know who they are. Every year, somewhere in the world, they experience some form of a climate shock that affects 30% of the yield in that part of their supply chain. So not 30% globally every year, but in some part of their supply chain, they have a 30% hit. So they're really concerned about that, because these supply chain disruptions are having a massive economic hit on their economics. So a little bit more on that third point around climate shocks. We know that virtually all businesses, particularly in food, of course, but businesses outside of food, have a massive dependency upon climate and nature, all natural systems actually. We need stable climate, we need plentiful and clean supply of water, we need ecosystem services, we need healthy soils, all of these things to be able to sustain our population. And most of these natural systems we know are in decline. Some are in small incremental declines each year, and others are in free fall, depending upon where in the world you talk about. So that's pretty scary. There are massive variations, obviously, from different parts of the world. I was recently at the Climate Week in New York talking to an agronomist who works in rice in India, and his view is that there's only 40 harvests left in rice in India because their soil systems are so degraded, and there's so much, every year, more and more dependent upon synthetic inputs to continue to deliver the yields that they've experienced over the past couple of hundred years, or who knows, thousands of years perhaps. So we know that the global food system is not really making material progress in the direction that we need to be heading in, and there's an extreme need, a radical need to shift the system so that we thrive into the future. So taking a closer look at climate change, John also mentioned the COP system there, and we know that the two biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the world come from energy, and the second is from the food production system. And COP28 was quite a seismic moment in our history, we think, because with the phase down, phase out of fossil fuels now creeping into the narrative, the spotlight is moving to the food system, the second largest emitter. So at COP28, we saw this, the UAE Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture. We saw the First Mover Coalition for Food, which is all about accelerating sustainable farming progress, and that was by the World Economic Forum. We saw the Action Agenda on Regenerative Landscapes, which is a coalition of Danone, Pepsi, Cargill and Nestle, some of those big global shapers. They are 4 of the 20 that I just referred to. We know about the Dairy Methane Pledge, and also philanthropists. People like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos made pledges at COP28 to invest in sustainable agriculture and food security. So it's now really widely recognised that we can't address our climate challenge without tackling food emissions. So leaders of those progressive companies that we're working with all the time are really starting to face into this challenge. They can no longer hide behind the fossil fuel industry. The spotlight is rapidly moving towards them, and they are rapidly focusing in on the scale of that challenge and what is required. This is a really interesting slide because it gives you a really good sense of what the scale of that seismic shift looks like. If you look at that first green bar, 1,405 gigatons is the total carbon budget that our planet has between 2020 and 2100 for a 67% chance of staying below the 2-degree ceiling. Now go up to that top blue bar. That is business as usual food emissions. We'll basically suck up that entire carbon budget out to 2100, which means that pretty much every other industry needs to be net zero in order for the food system to continue on as it is. If you drop down 1 bar to that light blue bar, that number, 500 gigatons, is the total carbon budget for us to have a 67% chance of the 1.5 degree limit. So that would mean food basically needs to divide emissions by 3, and every other industry on our planet needs to be net zero. So these numbers are all now widely published and understood by the food industry. So they're having a holy shit moment. How are we going to do this in order to be able to realise our 1.5 degree target, let alone our 2 degree target? So we're seeing action happening, of course. Progress starts with awareness, and awareness leads to goal setting, and with goal setting we usually get some action. And in 2020 I think we had, what's that number there, 65% of global emissions had a target. In 2024 it's closer to 90% of global emissions had a target. There's obviously not all targets are created equal. There are some really good targets and there are some really average targets, but encouragingly we're now seeing nearly 2,000 businesses have set science-based targets, which are legitimate targets. So climate is obviously a big challenge, but nature is also a significant challenge. And we know that the agricultural food system uses 50% of global land. We're responsible for about 70% of freshwater withdrawals. We're responsible for about nearly 80% of coastal lake and freshwater pollution. Lots of statistics when it comes to degradation of nature at the hands of the food industry, and there are some pretty terrifying ones. For example, 80% of deforestation has come by means of land clearing for the food system. We've been responsible for 40% of biodiversity loss, 30% of soil loss by means of clearing land for food production and harming and harmful farming practices. These are global numbers, not in New Zealand. I think, perhaps we're slightly better. That might be as a result of our young economy and our young farming system, but there's some major challenges when it comes to nature, and the world is really accelerating its view on what we might be able to do to protect nature from a food systems perspective. A lot of you will be familiar with this. This is the planetary boundaries concept that presents a set of 9 planetary boundaries with which humanity needs to stay within so that we thrive in generations to come. 6 of these have now been exceeded, including climate change, biosphere integrity, and land system change. That means that our biocapacity, our carrying capacity of our planet is being significantly diminished. We're unable to keep up with the rate of extraction and consumption that we're seeing currently. I really like the global footprint methodology, which you've probably heard of the term Earth Overshoot Day. That is the day in the year where we consume all of the natural resources that Mother Nature can naturally replenish in 12 months. And we overshot in 2023 on the 2nd of August. So basically from the 2nd of August through to 31st of December, we were clocking up debt to Papatūānuku, and we've been clocking up that deficit every year since the mid-1970s. So we've burnt quite a lot of furniture to keep ourselves warm over the past 50-odd years. So, there's no future in any of that. We've got to radically rethink and reimagine and rebuild everything so that we can turn all of this around. So, you can say that over the past 70 years since the industrialization of food, we've done a brilliant job of feeding billions more people for less, but that's come at a tremendous cost. And those really smart global food businesses that we're working with are really facing up to these facts. And they're asking themselves these 3 questions. How do we limit climate change to ensure that we make a contribution to that 1.5 degree target? That means reducing emissions 30 to 50% by 2030. It means being net zero by 2050, so we stay below that 1.5 degree limit, that ceiling. They're asking how we protect and restore nature, so that's about healthy and productive soil. It's about access to water, of course. It's about biodiversity enhancement, and we're really beginning to understand the value of restoring and maintaining forests and ecosystems that serve the food production system so well. And off the back of those, the food system companies are asking themselves, how the heck do we achieve both of those massive challenges while feeding 10 billion people, keeping them well nourished by mid-century? So, some massive challenges, but there is reasonable consensus in the global food industry that we have levers at our disposal to be able to achieve those targets. The first is around higher yields, hugely dependent upon investment in science, and it's a real tragedy to see the underinvestment in science, which has traditionally led us to better yields. I think over the past 30 years, we've achieved on average globally about a 1% improvement in yields. And that's mostly come through crop and animal genetics. But that forecasted rate over the past 30 years is actually projected into the modelling into the future at a linear rate, so a continuing 1%. But over the past few years, it's a bit too early to draw conclusions from the data. John, you might be all over this, but it looks like we're getting diminishing returns as a result of climate shocks that are hitting food production systems. They are outweighing the yield improvements we're seeing in global food systems. So perhaps we can't count on the yield improvements that we've seen in the past. So that's a real challenge. And also non-climatic shocks like the war in Ukraine, for example, we know is having a big impact on grain supply globally. This is always a terrifying one, reducing food waste. 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food waste. It's 2 or 3 times the total global aviation industry. If food waste was a country, only China and America would be bigger than it. Around 1/4, this is horrendous, 1/4 of the calories we produce are thrown away. They're either spoiled in the supply chain, lost in the retail network or through the food service industry, through restaurants, or they're lost in consumer households and wasted food in fridges. And it's actually worse than that. It's worse than one in 4 calories lost, because that data isn't capturing food waste during the harvest. So we've all worked on farms, and in the food system we know there's a whole lot of waste that happens on farm as well, which is hard to calculate, so it's not recorded in that number. So that's pretty terrifying. Massive opportunity to reduce food waste. Second is around healthy calories. There's some interesting symmetry in the modelling around calories. That is around 13% of adults globally are clinically obese, and around 39% are overweight, but 10% of the population are undernourished. So if you can imagine that, that bell curve, it's got equal sides. So there's this massive imbalance in food distribution in the world, and that is a big challenge to address, as we know. But we do know that the wealthy world needs to better understand how to eat to maintain a healthy weight, and in doing so, that could effectively free up food for those people in the world that are in need of better nutrition and better access to food. So this is a super complex world around that healthy calories challenge. Best farm practices, you guys know a whole lot about this. There is a huge difference between emissions of a given food system in a given, not even from country to country actually, but from region to region, even from farm to farm. So applying best known practices universally can have a massive impact, a massive positive impact on building a more resilient food system. And there's great work going on things like fertilizer management and use of technology, that sort of work that's being deployed from really progressive systems to less progressive systems for gain. Some of you are going to cringe at this one, but plant-rich diets, it's super important. The global food system needs to eat less meat and dairy effectively. That may make a huge contribution to global emissions. 77% of agricultural land is used for meat and dairy production, and just 18% of the world's calorie supply comes from that 77% of land use. Just 23% of agricultural land is used for plant-based food, and that supplies 82% of calories, or 63% of protein. So ideally, people in wealthier countries would eat less meat and dairy, which would free up land for plant-based food production and reforestation to sequester carbon. I'm talking globally here, and there are obviously opportunities for New Zealand to maintain those really important industries in beef and dairy. I'm going to get a little bit more to that about in the future. But we're going to get to a point where land use change is going to become a requirement in some parts of the world. Hopefully not this part of the world. That's why we need to maintain our competitive advantage in it, so we are not forced to undertake that kind of a radical change. So we recognise these 5 levers in our firm. We don't work on all of those 5 levers, but when those 5 levers intersect with climate and nature, we absolutely do. And we are working with all of those big global food shapers, or many of them, helping them address how they lean on those levers to address those 3 big questions that they're asking of themselves around climate, nature, and feeding the world. So on to my third point, is that there's a necessary shift required in the global food system, and that's going to have massive impacts for the New Zealand agri-food business. So in the face of all of that, what can we be thinking about in New Zealand business to protect and ideally boost our critical food export businesses? So in our opinion, there's 3 things. We've got to defend the top of the league table. We need to make sure that we stay at the top of that climate and nature league table in order to protect our interests in meat and dairy in particular, for those obvious reasons you've just seen before. Those global shapers that we're working with are taking a really close look at us and our performance, and they are comparing us versus competing suppliers from all around the world. They are looking at league tables every day, and they have data better than we have data. It is phenomenal the amount of research and work they are doing on comparing supply sources that will help them enable the delivery of their goals. So, we need to really deeply understand the on-farm interventions that are available to us now that relate to climate and nature. And we need to be able to understanding how they may be applicable to our farm systems, and we need to be implementing them now. Tomorrow is too late already. We need to be doing this stuff now. Some good progress has been made on this front, and we've seen some recent announcements and collaborations with global shapers and producers in New Zealand. Synlait have had great result with Nestle recently. Fonterra's also had a great result with Nestle investing in our farming systems to reduce emissions. So that work is underway, and we're making good progress, but we absolutely need to do more, and we need to accelerate. The second is around innovating to maintain our right to the top of the league table. This is where we need investment in science. We've got to keep that pipeline moving forward of innovations. We can't stand still, or we will be passed. I think Agri-Zero is a really good step. That's been a really great initiative, a really strong signal that we need to invest in accelerating progress for technology that's coming down the pipeline that will be able to be implemented on New Zealand farming systems. The third one, and this is a critical one, and maybe Dean will speak to a little bit about this next, but mobilising transition finance is absolutely critical to be able to do those first two things. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about this because we work a lot in this area. The food companies that we work with they really understand what it is that they need to be doing. They have hundreds, thousands of PhDs working in their companies figuring out how to transition to regen, for example. They all know what they need to implement in the farm systems in which they touch. But the question everyone asks is who's going to pay for it, because it's going to be expensive. So the areas I'd like to talk about now are, what is the extent of the funding required for the transition? Where should that be directed towards? What are the pain points slowing that transition? And what are the pipelines, the mechanisms in the pipeline that are working on solving those issues? So in terms of the numbers, they are big numbers. This is just in the next 10 years to transition cropping, actually. Pretty eye-watering, $2.5 to $4.5 billion US over the next 10 years just to transition cropping into a better system. So it doesn't include pastoral land, which we're so used to because there's just too many holes in that data to be able to get to a sensible number. But the bottom line there is that there is a whole lot of money required to transition the food system. And this number is pretty telling. This is where we in the food industry get to cry foul, because we are 26% of global emissions, but we get a tiny proportion, only 2% of the flow of current climate finance. So there's a big mismatch there. It's our own fault because we're really crap at building business cases for investment into food. The fossil fuel industry's done a really great job at attracting innovation and funding into transition, because compared to our challenge, it's relatively easy. You go to solar and you go to wind and you phase out coal. It's not that hard. But moving the food system is much more challenging. So our business cases are much harder to sell to investors. And therefore, we've only seen a small proportion of current global transition finance coming our way. When it comes to barriers to uptake, there's lots of them, and I won't go into all of these, but there's quite a lot of existing protectionism in traditional farming systems. There's insufficient evidence quite often that practice change results in strong economic outputs. There's risk around yields on trying different things. There's also a lack of standardized taxonomies in the industry. So people don't know they don't know what quite to measure and how. So there's a whole lot of challenges which is slowing down the investment in the food industry when it comes to the flow of finance. Now, some of you might get up and walk out when I want to talk about regenerative, because I know it is really controversial in New Zealand, but it's an example of where the money is flowing to. And the reason that I want to talk about this is because those 20 global food system shapers are really, really hot on transition to regenerative. And they see it, they're hot on it because they see it as the primary lever they've got to reaching their published climate targets. And I know there's a whole lot of debate in New Zealand around the role of regenerative ag, because we talk about the fact that we're largely farming regeneratively currently, and our soils aren't anywhere near the level of degradation that are being suffered in the Northern Hemisphere. But in many cases, we're making the same mistakes now that those Northern Hemisphere counterparties were, however many years or decades or centuries ago. So there's a huge amount of global capital flowing into regenerative transition. And where in regenerative that is flowing to looks something like this. Most of those big companies are doing their own insight work, that number one in the top right. They're doing their consumer proposition work to figure out where there is value that could accrue from transition to regenerative. They're doing their strategy development, but where they're actually really weak is in 4, 5, and 6, which is technical assistance on intervention design. So once again, that's where science can play in, and where institutions like this can add so much value in coming up with ideas that can transition farming systems to more regenerative programs. Incentivization is super important. So building financial and non-financial incentives for all actors in the value chain to participate in transition is super important. That will lead to higher adoption rates, which will result in implementation and scale. And then there's the MRV, which is a whole big role of technology there to make it easier for farmers and growers to report progress and do that transparently. So when it comes to, so that's where funding can be directed. 1, 2, and 3 is largely being self-funded by those large companies, as they should be. But they are asking who the heck is going to pay for 4, 5, and 6. So there's a real mobilization of thinking around where transition finance can come from. I really like this model. It's a really great on a page view of where transition finance is coming from and will come from in the future. And if you start at the right, these programs are really well underway already. Things like sustainable finance through linked loans, moving left into more innovative programs. What I really want to jump to there is the one on the left, which is blended finance. You may or may not have heard about blended finance, but what I'm talking about there is a merging of philanthropic and or government sources of capital with private capital, like debt from banks. Everyone's saying that this is going to be the thing that will save the food system. We need to mobilise capital from both of those sources to implement into the food system to be able to drive that sort of a change. So that's a segue into my final slide, which is a case study. And I really like this one because it takes all parts of that wheel slide that I shared with you before. They brought in blended finance to make this happen. It's Silk is a Danone North America brand, one of I think the 4th biggest food company in the world is Danone. Their North America business has massive scale. Silk is an alt milk brand. They have oat milk, almond milk, other sources of alt milk. Silk is a huge brand. They started off with an insight around the negativity of almond farming being poor for bee populations in central Californian valleys, and they wanted to do something about that. So they partnered with one of their retail partners, Costco. They came up with this idea of bee-friendly almond milk. They did a commercial deal with Costco, which funded the beginning of that concept. They then engaged the full value chain from so the retail, obviously the brand owner. They worked with the technical advisory institutions. They worked with the aggregators of almond growers, and they worked with the almond growers. And they basically came up with 3 very simple interventions to put on farm. One was planting cover crops between hedgerows. One was pest eradication. There's a third one, which I forget what it is now, but 3 really simple things. They put in an incentive program for all actors in the value chain to share in the costs and the benefits. Danone paid a cents per premium on every tonne or every kg of almonds supplied, so that the grower benefited. They worked with a third-party verifier to work with all of those 150 growers in that Central Californian Valley to measure and report on performance, and it was hugely successful. The brand saw 40% value uplift in Costco, and farmers benefited from that uplift over long-term 15-year uptake agreements for that production. Bee populations have thrived. It's been a perfect example of what is possible in coalescing all of the different needs of different actors in a value chain. We were so impressed with the group of people that pulled together that program that we bought them. So they are now part of our team, and we are rolling out this model across lots of different crops in North America and in Europe, and it's working really well. So this is a model I think we're going to see a lot more of in New Zealand. I hope we see a lot more of in New Zealand. That is value chains coming together, being galvanised around a shared purpose, sharing costs and benefits associated with that, moving from a more transactional relationship right through the supply chain, little transactions, from step to step in a value chain, rather having a partnership model from right at the end of the funnel to going right back to the individual grower and farmer. This is what all of the global shaping food companies are wanting to move to. It's incredibly complex. Currently, it's only being done in a really small scale, in crop by crop, region by region, industry by industry. But I think in New Zealand, we really need to embrace that idea proactively. We need to build these value propositions to attract the capital into these kind of crop by crop initiatives, pilots, to be able to get the ball moving here. So really, I think this is the end for me. There's three things we need to think about. We need to be thinking about how we defend our position at the top of the league table, particularly in meat and dairy. We need to innovate to be able to stay there for the long term, and we need to be thinking about how we can build value propositions that will attract capital into our food system in New Zealand. This is what we believe to be so important for us in the near term. It's the big generational challenge that we face, certainly, but there's also a massive prize for us in the industry if we rise to the occasion. That's it for me. Thank you.
Hamish, thank you very much. As always, a pleasure. Dean Spicer from ANZ, Head of Sustainable Finance, will take us through. Is the beamer still working? Oh, it's okay. We'll take us through the background of finance of the green economy.
Tēnā koutou katoa, na mihi nui, kia koutou, nā mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Ko Dean Spicer tōku ingama. It's my privilege to be here. It's a bit daunting following on from John Hamish, I must say. So I'll do my best, but you probably heard the best part already. There will be a bit of crossover, but I am going to try and focus on the financing aspect of financing the green economy. And it's a pleasure to return to Lincoln, which was my university. I attended last century, so things have no doubt changed a bit since I was here. Look, I think standing here today and listening to the previous speakers, I think there's a significant opportunity here. I find it is very exciting, but any change, any transition, it comes with challenges, and I think certainly that can feel a bit daunting. But for New Zealand, I think we need to sort of see this as a mega trend. I believe it is a mega trend. My background was working in financial markets, and so we had a sort of a cliche that the trend was your friend. And if you believe this is a mega trend, then you need to get on board with that and find a way to position this. I think it is going to continue. I wanted to start with a definition of the green economy, and I looked around and there wasn't really an internationally agreed definition as such, but I liked one that I pulled out from the UNEP that said that it was one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing environmental risks and ecological scarcities. It is low carbon, resource efficient and socially inclusive. And I think that's important to remember the social element of all of this, because the way we transition is going to be important, and if we don't have a just transition, if we leave people behind or communities behind, that's going to be very painful, and I don't think that's really what we aspire to. It also sort of came to that definition was from 2011 and 2020. a group came together in New Zealand. It's called the Sustainable Finance Forum. It was collaboration across the private and public sector with a view to producing a report which was a roadmap for action. And one of the recommendations was to set up this Centre for Sustainable Finance to try and enact that roadmap, which actually has happened. But the vision from that forum was a financial system that was more resilient, inclusive, robust, and agile through the incorporation of environmental, social, and economic considerations in financial decisions. And so I think that's important. Again, we recognise that we're not there yet. There's a whole lot of challenges that are captured in that. And look, when we talk about sustainable finance and green finance, there are global principles that have been established by the Loan Markets Association and the Capital Markets Association to help guide a consistent approach to labelling green finance. And increasingly, we're seeing jurisdictions that are indeed developing sustainable finance taxonomies to define green activities. So I'll try to. So that was me. So look, this is a slide from the Climate Bonds Initiative highlighting that around the globe we're seeing more taxonomies be defined. The EU has led this, and a cornerstone to the EU Sustainable Finance Framework is the taxonomy. It's an important market transparency tool. It helps direct investment to green activities needed for the transition. The New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Finance that I mentioned is currently working with a group to establish recommendations for a New Zealand taxonomy. The draft recommendations are out shortly and open through to the 5th of May. One of our team at ANZ is working as part of that group to try to bring that to life. So look, I think when we look at the opportunities for New Zealand within this global context, I think that's really important. And I think it's already been well positioned. And Hamish talking about the global perspective is really important. One, because we're a large exporter of goods and services, but we're also a very large importer of capital. And so if you look at whether it's our government bond program, there's a large portion of that is supported by global investors. Equally, for funding the private sector, the bank market does fund itself from those international markets. And so our ability to export and products and import capital is really dependent on the global perception of New Zealand as a green economy. And so I think that perspective is very valid and very important. So looking at where's the market come from, where is it today? So the global sustainable finance market had a peak in 2021. However, the energy sector reached a new high of 84.5 billion financed in 2023. 2/3 of that was in renewables. I think that comes back to that point Hamish is making, that that there's a lot of activity, a lot of financing, but a lot of it's been directed in certain sectors more so than others. And so I think that point there, perhaps the food, beverage, agri sector of this component is not necessarily where all that finance has been driven to. Equally for New Zealand. So look, I think New Zealand is a very small component, obviously, of the global sustainable finance market or the global financing market overall. Interesting enough, though, New Zealand's probably punched above its weight. I mean, when we look at the year-on-year change when the market sort of got going, and look, if you remember 2020, because I'll refer to it shortly, but we've basically had growth year-on-year, which has exceeded the global growth in sustainable finance since that point in time. Our peak came in 2022. A year later, last year was a slight drop off, and our market here has really been dominated by utilities, again with a renewable grid. Then certainly that has supported activity in green financing for the generation, electricity generators, for example, the property sector through green buildings, and government sectors as well, with Auckland Council being one of the first New Zealand borrowers of green bonds in New Zealand. So what's been behind the growth? So look, we ran a poll with Finance Asia last year, and the poll found that alignment to sustainability objectives, better access to capital, and investor diversification were the top 3 drivers for borrowers of sustainable finance bonds and loans. I still think those 3 things remain, and my point there being that what we find is that to continue to access capital, there's an increasing focus from investors globally around the sustainability of the companies themselves. So whether you're raising debt or equity, whether you have a green bond or just a regular debt issue, the scrutiny and of the company is becoming greater all the time. So that barrier, that bar keeps rising over time. New Zealand's seen significant regulation. We talked about that before around policy initiatives. Well, here it is, a bit of a snapshot looking backwards, and I talked about 2020 before because that was when there was the announcement that New Zealand was going to adopt mandatory climate disclosure reporting, and it was also the time when I decided to take on the role in sustainable finance. I remember quite distinctly that there was a bit of a pivotal shift when suddenly I realised, well, this is actually going to be mandated. We're actually going to have to do this. If we were going to do it, then the question shifted from why to how, and what other opportunities go with that. If it's a regulatory requirement, then it rose to the board level in terms of how they're going to manage that and who's going to take responsibility for it. So I think we don't necessarily always like a whole lot of regulation, but I think there's certainly certain regulation that is quite supportive, and I think this was one of them. So New Zealand, was one of the first to announce mandatory climate disclosures. A report out yesterday by Chapman Tripp for the Aotearoa Circle highlighted that, in fact, 80% of New Zealand's exports by value are going to countries that either have mandatory climate-related disclosures, either in force or proposed, and in 60% of GDP is now covered by these such disclosures. In addition, an emerging trade measure is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are imposing a cost of embedded emissions on certain products. In the EU, it applies currently to cement, iron, steel, and some other products. So not necessarily on our exports today, but I think it's worth recognising that 40% of New Zealand exports are going to countries with climate border adjustment mechanisms in place or planned. So I guess my point would be that we can't sort of sit on our laurels and think we're okay because we've got an efficient system. There is a shift going on globally, and if we want to keep accessing our markets, we need to be aware of that and make adjustments accordingly. From a New Zealand perspective, and I think this is also reflected globally, and I won't touch on it too long because I think probably other speakers have probably covered it well. But no, we are sort of seeing a shifting in terms of consumer preferences, even in New Zealand. And look, I think this is a report from last year which recognised that there is an impact happening from the cost of living in terms of people's preferences. And so, obviously, if you're having affordability issues, you may end up choosing products that are less sustainable. But ultimately, there's a belief that companies need to do more, and ultimately a desire for to embrace this trend that's coming through. So I think consumer preferences, as Hamish pointed, that should be a driver. Ultimately, it's just another signal that we need to be aware of where these preferences are going. And equally, this is a KiwiSaver summary, which talks about, again, consumer preferences, if you like, from investment funds. So, and that's really what we're seeing globally. When we go out to raise capital as a bank and we speak to investors, then they are asking the questions, because ultimately, funds will move depending on the ability for the fund manager to show that they are operating in an efficient manner. So this is really broad-based. I think the reason why I call it a mega trend is when you look at all the various stakeholders, all the various actors in the system, and they're all pointing in the same direction, then it sort of signals that this is a trend that's going to remain and sustain. So look, I think sustainability needs to be seen, therefore, as a fundamental strategic focus. Increasingly, companies are establishing science-based targets, which Hamish mentioned, and with that, there's a commitment to manage their Scope 3 emissions, and ultimately that means that they're focusing on their supply chains and their suppliers. So regardless whether you're a big company or a small company, ultimately you're going to be caught in someone's supply chain, and therefore if you're not being asked for it today, then very soon every company is going to be able to need to show that they are measuring their emissions and have a sustainability strategy in place, and two, that they are taking action. So some key considerations. I think transparency through data capture and reporting will support better performing companies and show up those who are therefore lagging. I touched on this being a megatrend. So where do I sort of see the green economy being in 10 years' time? I think I fully expect that we're going to see an upswing in the growth, and this will support businesses who have embraced the concept, as I mentioned at the start. If New Zealand has an ambition to double the value of our exports by value in the next 10 years, we need to therefore embrace these signals we're getting. A couple of reports that came out I thought I would highlight, again, talking about the magnitude of, I suppose, the opportunity or the challenge, but a Deloitte report, which was titled Asia Pacific's Turning Point, estimated that climate inaction would cost the region $96 trillion by 2070. Including $2 trillion for Australia and New Zealand. Conversely, the gains from decarbonisation was estimated to be $47 trillion over the same period, including $860 billion for Australia and New Zealand. Another report out recently was the KPMG 2022 CEO survey, and the 87% of New Zealand CEOs believed that the major global challenges such as income inequality and climate change are a threat to their company's long-term growth and value. Therefore we need to focus on the opportunity and recognise some of these challenges that are there. Again, I sort of echoed through, and I'd highlight that point that income inequality, the social impacts that go with some of these shifts are really important. I think one of the things we've talked a lot at today has been around climate mitigation, how we reduce our emissions, and that's really important. Coupled with that is obviously climate adaptation and what that means in terms of the resilience of our businesses, and particularly if you're talking about land-based businesses, which you can have a very productive farming system, but if you get inundated by climate events or by sea level rises, then that's not going to be too great. And so, look, that was just a snapshot of Wellington, because that's where I currently live these days. But you can sort of see that under a couple of scenarios there, whether we're talking about sea level rise or climate events, then built up areas are impacted. Coastal, we're very much a coastal country, so this is going to be a really big issue. And I suppose the point I'm making there is that we still haven't really worked out who's going to pay. And I think that was one of the points raised before. If we need to invest to do things differently, then how do we do that? We're seeing. I actually had a video I was going to try to play, but I didn't quite manage to work to bring it across. But what it was showing was really that even here in New Zealand, there's examples of some really interesting projects which have sort of taken on nature-based solutions to building infrastructure. And so we're sort of seeing examples there where perhaps the old way of building grey infrastructure and building something bigger and stronger in theory, there may be some better ways of doing that that embrace nature, but have additionality in terms of the solutions they provide, building green spaces, and actually end up being more effective and cost efficient. So I think it just highlights that there's a lot here, but it's really important to start to think about this, because the insurability of risks that are here is going to be an issue that impacts on business continuity, and so there's going to be some real challenges, and I don't think necessarily that financial markets or are really fully capturing the impact of some of the climate risk that's there, and largely because it's incredibly difficult to measure or model. So look, I'm probably going to just leave you with that thought that while there's a lot of challenges, I would go back to my first point. I see this as a mega trend, and I think it's one that creates enormous opportunity for Aotearoa New Zealand. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Now it's your time to ask questions. And may I ask the panelists to come forward, Hamish, Dean, John. And so now this is your chance to ask questions. And remember, you get questions over lunch that you can ponder on. Who am I allowed to give the first?
Good morning, Mike Manning is my name. A question really for John and Hamish. So who pays? Who pays? So John, you suggested that the end consumer might by virtue of research. And of course, when you ask them, would you pay more for those credence attributes? They go, oh, of course I would. But when it comes to actually forking out their hard-earned cash, they generally don't. When, Hamish, you talk to the processors, they have targets and sincere targets, no doubt. But then you go, would you pay for those? They generally go, no. You want to supply, son, you pay. And so it comes back to the farmer or the grower paying for their externalities, and they go, heck, my business model wasn't predicated on that. And you're going to put this wave of cost on me. You'll dislocate me financially. That won't suit me, it won't suit my community, and it won't suit the country. So who's going to pay?
Great question. Economists love that sort of thing. So a couple of things I'll just jump in before maybe Hamish wants to give a better answer. First, I'd just say that, you know, we get this idea, and I put up those figures, people will pay X amount for, and I think the first thing you think is, we just went up to them in the supermarket and went, would you pay if I made this product nice? And they went, 10%. So it's a sophisticated sort of statistical method called choice experiments, which forces them to make trade-offs between different bundles. So just to say it's a little more sophisticated than that, to try and tease out their actual purchasing behavior, forcing them to make trade-offs, as if you've got two products in front of you in the supermarket and you have to choose based on what's there. So it is at least a level deeper, but of course you could say, look, I think that's a bit high, look, I think there, but at least it's showing they do care. And I think there is evidence, and Hamish had some great stuff, of people actually putting their hand in their pocket. But we can argue about the levels. And I think part of the trouble with who's going to pay, New Zealand doesn't have a culture of subsidising their agriculture. And we're up against countries who very much subsidise their agriculture and are very much subsidising their agriculture for Green Deal, sustainability, biodiversity. So I think it's a bit against our nature to want to say the government should start giving us money to make this transition, which is why we end up with carbon pricing. And, you know, economists, we want the externalities to be with the producers, but it's a bit rich to say, look, we've been living off the back of you producers for so long, now we want to tax you out of the blue. It's like there's hardworking people who have really struggled, and it's not an easy job, which is why the economists say, we'll give these transition periods. And so my trouble is every time we say, oh, maybe we'll do it later, is a disservice to those producers, because it's going to come from somewhere, and that's when you will have those painful transitions. So I'd be in support of maybe government helping, you know, if it's green loans or capital to help transition, but unless we have a framework that says you're going to have to pay at some point, you can't start putting in and slowly transitioning production systems. We have good farmers who will be able to respond to challenges, and sure, there'll be some pain, but if we can support and put it over longer, the less pain. And also just saying, I think there is some rewards out there for producers in the market, because we want to say, let's get it from everywhere, let's get it from government, let's get it from consumers, that they appreciate what we're doing and appreciate we're good if we can talk to them. Anyway, that's my, sorry Hamish, you've probably got much better things to say.
80% of my job is working with those food companies to answer exactly that question. And there's a huge spectrum of program around who is going to pay for it. One end of the spectrum is, for example, Mars Corporation, who have said we're going to invest 1% of our net sales value into transforming the value chain every year. And if they think if they do that through 2050, they will have gotten to the point where they would have achieved their objectives. So they are putting their money on the line. Other clients we're working with, like for example McDonald's, are saying that we won't be investing in transformation which increases our cost of product, because we don't think our audience is prepared to pay a premium on their Big Mac for regeneratively sourced beef, for example. But what they are investing in is supporting the value chain to be able to improve systems which build resilience and commercial returns through the value chain. A really good example of that, well, there's so many examples I could talk about this all day with you. Unfortunately, we won't get a chance to do that. But for example, Unilever is, they've got 34 pilots running currently in transition to regen. The one we've been mostly working with them around is transition to regenerative systems in Spain for tomatoes. They're seeing around 14% yield improvement across the board, and that is turning into profitability improvements for their value chain. So they're funding those programs to get those farmers started, which is resulting in them having more resilient food systems. That's resulting in profitable growth for them, which isn't having a cost of goods sold impact on their product, and therefore they don't have to pass on those prices to consumers. Another good example is we're working with General Mills on a rice program in Arkansas. They're seeing a similar improvement in yield. So by funding those kind of transitions at the farm level, they're seeing the benefits flow to the grower, and they're locking in long-term offtake agreements, so those farmers have total transparency around what they will be able to sell at what price over a long period of time, which helps them commit to capital. Of course, the upfront capital is the critical thing to facilitate. That beef-friendly almond milk example that you saw, $1 of that transition came from philanthropic capital, so they took a first loss risk on that investment, which allowed them to leverage $9 from Bank of America, who basically funded those farmers transitioning to those beef-friendly practices, just those 3 implementations. So they got a basis point reduction on a loan, or they transitioned existing loan into that fund, so they had a lower cost of capital, but they also got a premium on supplying that those oats through to the banana customer. There's a whole lot of different ways to cut it. There are some really good proof points that it's working. The scale of the transition capital it needs to be able to make the impact that we need is, we're tip of the iceberg. We're chipping away. Case studies like the Danone one, case studies like the Unilever tomato, General Mills rice. There's increasingly good evidence that there is commercial imperatives right through the value chain to act.
Thank you so much. We have another question in the room, and then I will give the microphone to Katie, because there are also a couple of questions online. So no, dear ladies and gentlemen online, we haven't forgotten about you.
Kia ora. Thank you, panellists. My name's David Simmons. I'm a failed retiree. I spent just over 40 years here at Lincoln and set up the tourism courses and was professor of tourism. I'm a little bit surprised, but maybe it's the way it's cast. We've talked about the green economy, but I was sort of tied up in this thing that was called 100% pure. And this year it's gone back to New Zealand's single biggest foreign exchange earner at 20%. If you dice and slice your cows and cattle finely enough and put butter there and cheese and dairy and other sorts of things. But what we do know is that a metric I mentioned to John before is that in terms of millions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions, and this is the rub, per $1 million of value added to the economy, tourism is much sootier than agriculture. It is above mining, but below forestry, fisheries and agriculture. Yet, heading into this sort of recession, we have ministers of finance of both colours saying, well, we'll just turn the tourism tap on because we have got high volume, high cash flow, but low yield. So the reason I'm asking, with a provocation to John, is how come you've got all these little bits of sectors there, but you haven't got tourism there as an export sector in your portfolio? So we'll talk about that later. But I'm looking for some insights as to, in this global industry, what sort of top-line bullet point advice you could offer to the tourism sector.
So
Shall I have a go at that first? Since I did the last question, I'll take on the hard question. Look, I think it's a really valid point, and look, I think transport emissions make up some 20% of New Zealand's emissions. So, addressing that is important. I think there are some interesting developments, and I think again it comes back to that research and development point, because this is a challenging area. I know there's been a lot of work going on various solutions. One which is particularly interesting is around, for the aviation sector, around sustainable aviation fuels, which has the potential to address some of our waste issues that was discussed earlier. So it can be a solution to the circular economy, and the drop-in SAFs, are seen by, talked about by airlines as a potential solution to reduce the overall emissions intensity of those flights. Obviously, coupled with that, it comes back down to them what makes up those fuels and what sort of products have gone into them. If they're actually agricultural products, then are you actually sort of creating another problem in terms of land use change to deliver those? I think what's positive in this space is that there is the development of next generation SAF, which is actually using diverse waste streams. So again, for a New Zealand economy like New Zealand, where we actually have an abundance of waste that we're trying to work out what we can do with, that does create some hope that we can take something that is a problem and turn it into something that could be a viable solution to the aviation sector. That's one area, but I think it's a very fascinating one. The airlines are faced with either being able to find a solution like SAFs, or having to pay for the course of offsets, which are going up in price. So I think ultimately the viability of their product, if you like, is at stake here. So obviously they're motivated to find solutions. I think again, from a New Zealand localized perspective, we're sort of seeing the trials with electric aircraft for short run flights in New Zealand, which won't necessarily help us in terms of those long haul flights in the short term. But look, I think there's some solutions there, but as in all of these things, it probably needs further development. And look, I think there's a challenge around getting financing into some of these innovative but unproven technology solutions. And so again, that blended finance is going to be quite important, I think, to addressing some of these challenges.
Funny, isn't it? I guess I had that slide sort of taking a step back and looking at, just a slight point, looking back at the New Zealand economy through a climate lens, going, wait, we doubled down on cattle? Like, oh, okay, right, we'll manage that. Oh, well, what else did we do with our GDP and economy? Oh, we went really big into tourism and flying people over from Germany and Europe over to New Zealand. It's like, yeah, we've really bet on the wrong horses climatically and doubled down. And I think there's part of that. I don't know, the 100% pure, it's sort of, we're on thin ice, I think. Everyone in the agricultural industry knows why that might not be 100%, 99, maybe less. But it's still a perception we have that we can leverage to be cynical, but we can try and live up to, because I think if that goes, suddenly this, why do tourists still come if there's a high burden? Well, because there's a perception we are doing things right elsewhere. We are trying our best, that we're environmentally focused, and we know where that's not true, but incentives, we need to do that as insurance that we still are this player who can trade on that ideal. And yeah, so thin ice for New Zealand, but also the agricultural industry. It's all built by woofers from Germany, or would we have anyone to serve us coffees in Wellington if we didn't have tourists coming over and staying a while? That it's something we depend on in a few ways. So important industry, but yeah, God, tread lightly, New Zealand. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Katie. We have a couple of questions online.
So this question has come from Reese Taylor. This one is directed at Hamish, but perhaps Dean and John might have something to add as well. So could Hamish list the 20 firms who control such a major part of the global food business and are beginning to focus on soil conservation, carbon emissions, and habitat or biodiversity issues? Do all have trade with New Zealand? And an addendum to that, are all committed to investing in moves towards regenerative farming, and any here in New Zealand?
That's quite a question. I would fail at listing all 20 off the top of my head, but I could certainly email them to you, Reese. We work with most of those 20 in some capacity, with some of them really closely. The ones we work with really closely are really doubling down on transition to regenerative. They're totally invested in that. For the point that I made when I was chatting, is that they see it as the main lever that they've got at their disposal to realise their climate ambitions. I'm trying to think of all the parts of Reese's question. Most of them, I would say 16 or 18 of them have a direct buyer relationship with New Zealand food production companies. Trying to think of the one or two that don't. Coke, they don't buy sugar from here. They buy a lot of sugar. They obviously we don't grow sugar here, but they've got wide food businesses. They pretty much all do. I think about PepsiCo. They buy potatoes. They all have some impact on New Zealand. New Zealand is such a food basket for the world that if it's not a first degree relationship, it's absolutely a second or third degree relationship. Katie, help me with the 5th, 8th, and 12th part of Reese's question.
Are all committed to investing in moves towards regenerative farming?
Yes, they are. I mentioned, I think, in the first part of my answer, more so than any other aspect, they see it as the number one lever. What did he mention right at the end of the question that I think I might have missed?
Shall I read the whole question again? Would that? Yeah?
No, that's fine.
It's basically asking, basically, do they all have trade with New Zealand? Are they moving towards regenerative agriculture? I think you've pretty much got all of it.
Yeah. And the important thing is they're all watching us and what we do now and in the future, and they will make their buying decisions based upon the action that we take now. I know Reese, he should email me if he has further questions that I might be able to embellish upon.
Thank you so much, Hamish. And Hamish was talking about this large Canadian food producer. I think they're providing approximately 80% of all the French fries in food service. And you should actually Google them and actually look at that company and what their definition is of regenerative, then try to project that on the New Zealand agriculture sector. We have a long way to go. Katie, more questions?
So this is actually another question from Reese. Thank you, Reese. Isn't California running out of underground water for irrigated almond orchards? Regardless of greenwashing the bee friendliness, could or should we be growing almonds in New Zealand?
That looks like me. Yeah, there's a few elephants in the room when it comes to growing almonds. Bee friendly was one initiative. I know they have a bunch of other initiatives following up. I know water is a massive challenge in those central Californian valleys. It's a massive challenge in lots of parts of America. I know that it's a real problem for the hop growing industry and where a lot of hops are grown in Colorado, for example. So there's water stress all over that continent that I think they're struggling to face into. Could we grow almonds in New Zealand? I'm not sure. I'm sure there's agronomists in this room that know much more about that than I do. There's absolutely going to be forced upon us, I think, land use change. And we need investment in science to be able to help us better understand what things in which part of the world are best grown for the lowest climate and nature impact. So who knows, maybe there is a great opportunity for almonds in New Zealand. I know there was some really interesting work being done out of Lincoln, I think, on a particular strain of soy, which could be perfectly suited to be grown in Canterbury as a really great source of plant-based protein. So that was an interesting piece of work that I came across at Sinlay. I can't remember who was leading that here, but I think there will be really significant changes in the geography for where those critical commodities are produced in the future, and we need to invest in science to better understand that.
Any more questions in the room?
Yeah, Oliver Roberts, Duncan Cottrell. I'm guessing that in order to sort of make progress and measure progress, that the collection of data is absolutely vital to the system and verifying the system. How much of a challenge is data in New Zealand? How far ahead or behind are we?
This is something we come up against a lot, especially with environment and agriculture. And you just look over to Europe, the UK, the US, and just see the absolute wealth, and especially longitudinal wealth of data with land use. So, you know, you talk about a study here and you'd be like, okay, we've got 5 years of what producers did in different sections of land. And you look to the UK and they'll have a history of 120 years of like biodiversity enhancing or other activities, environmentally enhancing things on farms that were just in a completely different league than what's happening overseas. And as we're sort of getting in, so new satellite technology is filling some of the gaps. And, you know, these national science challenges, so big 10-year pots of funding, crossing, they had these great things, the data supermarket, a lot of people doing some really sophisticated things of getting us up to speed on what land use is happening, sort of environmental impacts of our land use in New Zealand, and filling some of those gaps. You're going, oh God, thank God, it's finally there. And us as researchers are so data hungry, you know, I talk about modeling. The more data we have, the more we can do, the more we can be smart about what's possible on a land and what's already happening on it. And so finally, we're sort of catching up a bit to this. Well, what's happened to those national science challenges halfway through the year? Gone. And so that's, you know, all the work I said about the premiums, they were on the back of some of that funding, all this work on getting this data there. So it's almost like we've finally made a first step to it, but suddenly we're again in a funding black hole with the signal is the national science challenges won't continue. I don't know if that's going to be a priority for the new government. So really, yes, it is a challenge in New Zealand, but thanks to satellite technology, GIS stuff, we're sort of started catching up. But again, that's another thing science funding and innovation can really do, is support scientists to put the data there so you know, people smarter than me can do things with it and analyze what's happening and what we can do better. So in answer to your question, yes, and it's a bit worrying at the moment about us not just, you know, continuing to shorten that gap with what's available overseas. So, sorry, not too doom and gloomy, I hope, but yeah.
Maybe a little additional point on that. We spend a lot of time working in the ag tech world, and there are some phenomenal technologies in play through the likes of Google X or whatever they're called now. Some amazing breakthroughs using technology that can help the transition. So really interesting space, super hard to keep up with, massively fragmented, but some of those big players, Google, Amazon, investing trillions into that area, and it may not save us, but it will help us report more effectively about what we can do better to save us.
We have another question here.
Hamish, just a comment or question, if I can. The example you used with your almond milk, when we consider generally the full life cycle analysis, and when we calculate, say, the greenhouse gas footprint per kg of product, often it's worse for that sort of example. I haven't done it for almonds, but it's often worse. So the example's fine, but it probably needs the caveat of doing that piece of work so we know for sure that we're making progress rather than just feeling good.
Yeah, and all of those companies we work with, they live for intensity reporting. So they all run league tables by crop, so they understand for every input source, ranging from soy, wheat, canola, dairy, milk. The database is massive. They've got data scientists running that maths, so they know who's, you know, top of the leaderboard, and they have got active strategies to phase their procurement strategy out of the high intensity producers to the low intensity producers. And that, you know, that's why as I mentioned, we need to fight to protect our position at the top of the leaderboard when it comes to climate and dairy, for example, because others are creeping up on us and closing that gap. We need to move fast. And as I mentioned, those global food companies have got better data than we have, so they've got a massive insight into where they will transition their procurement strategy to.
Thank you so much. Any more questions in the room? Haha. Now you know where it's coming, right? It's over to the three of you to pose a question to our wonderful audience. And then Katie promised me a really nice lunch for all of us. And I'll start on this side with Dean, if I may.
Oh, well, thank you. Look, I was going to pose a question that's often on my mind, and that is, given the opportunities that we've been discussed this morning in terms of New Zealand's place in the world, what could we be doing to accelerate our position? That's sort of, whether that's from a financing perspective or from other things. I'll be interested to see whether there's any thoughts or insights around that aspect. Thank you.
Cheers. Well, take the wind right out of my sails with a good question, but I guess mine was already implicit in sort of my end points of my slides. But what would an ideal sort of policy framework or policy incentives in New Zealand be to encourage a transition in the agricultural sector that would be just for the producers, would be effective for the consumers, and would really help encourage positive change for us to get the best of this, stay on top of the league table? That's really cool. Thanks, Hamish. But it keeps us ahead of the game and make sure we don't lose out to other countries who are also being competitive. Australia and the EU is all encouraging their producers to be along this way. What would be an effective policy framework and incentivizing to help our producers stay in the game? Cool, thank you.
I had a question planned, but I'm going to change it based upon your question and based upon what you just said, John. What I'm really interested in is what is the next dairy for New Zealand? I know there's really cool innovations like John Penno's Leaf Foods, the plant-based protein from leafy greens, which looks really interesting. That could be a game changer for New Zealand. But what do we need to do in this country? Or perhaps we're already doing it, so please tell me if we are. What do we need to do to accelerate our understanding of the next thing that we could dominate the climate emissions intensity league table on? Could we produce low emissions soy better than the Brazilians? Could we produce some form of oil better than the current leader in global canola supply, for example? So, what would it take for New Zealand to have a really clear strategy mapped out over the decades ahead for we're targeting you in that country making that product, and we are going to dominate that, and we're going to bring that industry to New Zealand because it's going to be good for all corners of society and the economy?
Thank you so much. I'm already making my answers. I don't know what you guys are doing, but my brain is ticking away. Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, John. Thank you, Hamish. Until now, lunch. And Katie is smiling at me, so there is lunch. So that is really good. Okay. Oops. Okay. We're too efficient, so we can sing a song. And that's another one. Who wants to react on the questions from the panel? Ooh, this is good. Let's go for. Did you pick up your Nick? No. Oh, would have been really good.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly self-serving because we do a lot of the work, but I think a clear no-brainer is to allow foreign capital into New Zealand. I've done OIO work for 20 years, and I just can't understand the paranoia about not allowing foreign capital in, and it's not improved with the current government. And farmers need capital and less debt, and we're going to need far more capital flowing to get some of these projects done. So for me, that's just a no-brainer.
Yes, look, I think we probably need, I like the metric, greenhouse gas emissions per $1 million of value added. People have said to me, you're a very strange professor of tourism. You don't like it very much, to which I have to retort, that's not part of the job description. But how would emissions or environmental footprints across various parts of agriculture and fisheries and forestries and education and tourism as leading service sectors look? Because in a former life, I chaired the university research committee, but the sectors simply don't talk to each other. So New Zealand Inc., it seems in my mind, needs to migrate to its most resource efficient proposition. So the sort of commodities view of buckets of milk with millions of litres of water attached, where the water is then taken off and then the milk powder sold overseas, soon to be followed by exporting of water, seems like an environmental nonsense. But at the same time, I have heard that there are grain farmers in and around Geraldine who grow heritage crops which lead to the very best whiskies in the world, or hops. And so I think we need to kind of actually have the insights which inform us as to where our ecological efficiencies are, and then find the levers to migrate to those, because I'm really worried about what you put up in terms of how steep the curve is in dairy, even in the short term, let alone the long term.
So your solution is make spirits from the water that we take out of the milk?
That's the one.
Okay.
Thanks. So Dean, you asked the question, what else you could do? You've recently joined AgriZero, ANZ, and so well done. You might convince some of the other colleagues in the banking industry to follow suit. That'd be a good thing to do, I think, because it's, I think, an industry-led, serious, large commitment of capital effort to reduce methane and nitrous oxide. So I think that'd be a good next step. Hamish, I was going to make a comment and now I've just forgotten, but it'll come back to me later. But anyway, that's that one. Thanks.
Any other people in the room that want to answer or give a thought on the challenges?
What's the one big thing we could do as an idea? A methane vaccine. New Zealand's footprint is 50% ag, as John said, dominated by methane. If we could get a methane vaccine quickly, it would help New Zealand and it would help a lot of the world. So that wouldn't immediately disrupt our, not that it need not be disrupted at some point, but in the near term, it wouldn't allow disruption. Major benefit if we could do a methane vaccine.
John, we need to allow land use change to actually occur. Currently, this country is very woke, or not very hopeless at allowing any farmers to change land. I'll give you an example. ECAN just recently declined a farm down in South Canterbury, 100 hectares going into apples because of its current footprint was higher. So we just don't have policy at all to allow farming land or farmers to change their land at all. It's just crazy. The amount of hoops and stuff we've got to jump through to prove that farming system is having none to minor impact on farmers is outrageous. And the money that we're currently spending on consultants to prove these is absolutely outrageous too.
Any more thoughts, solutions? Thanks, Nick, by the way. One of the things that Dean and myself talked about once is we have 5 major banks in New Zealand. What if all those 5 major banks would talk to their 5 largest customers and basically ask them one question? Do you want your capital to do good, yes or no? Or do you want to be a meanie or a nice guy? Question mark. Of Of course, it's a really mean question because we probably already know the answer. If we then could convince those 5 large clients from every bank, every of the banks in New Zealand to put in some money into an impact fund, at that moment in time, we will ask the banks to double that. At that moment in time, we go to the government and we ask them to double that as well. And at that moment in time, we will have an impact fund. That impact fund will be able to fund the research and development that John was talking about. We would actually then give that money available to all the 8 universities in New Zealand. We let the banks actually govern that impact fund because that's what they do, right? They make sure that they can look at money. At that moment in time, we could actually partly fund that research and create that partnership that Hamish was talking about. So that would be my 2 cents worth. Any other ones in the room? Lunch, Katie? It's coming. Okay, thank you so much. Lunch is being served. For the people online, unfortunately, you're not here, but yeah, make sure that you take care of yourself and get some beverages out of your fridge, and don't waste food. So yeah, we'll talk to you later. Thank you very much and enjoy the food.